Did you see the latest Nintendo newsletter?
Whoa, nice graphics. I'd like to get my hands on that game.
You mean you haven't played it yet? We can play it on my Nintendo Entertainment System.
The original Legend of Zelda was an immediate smash hit success, both critically and financially. And following that success, Shigeru Miyamoto, the game's producer and lead designer, was unfortunately rather bogged down with another project. At the time, he was working on Super Mario Bros. 3, which would go on to be his greatest financial and critical success of the NES era. But the game's advanced graphics, intricate level design, and new overworld system all required much more out of him and the team at NRD4 than any previous title had. And so, much of the senior staff at Nintendo was rather bogged down with its production. Still, when a smash hit game comes out, no developer wants to leave it on the back burner for too long. And with Shigeru Miyamoto seeing the potential of Zelda as a mainline series for the company, as well as his desire to one day return as its lead developer, he knew that a sequel, produced for the NES, would be necessary in order to keep the Zelda franchise relevant in the coming years, before he could produce the game's next installment on Nintendo's upcoming 4th generation hardware. So, with Shigeru Miyamoto as the producer, and nothing more, Zelda II: The Adventure of Link was made. A game that retained none of Zelda 1's previous staff, or game philosophy, or genre, or quality. Is this game even real? Yes, to address the elephant in the room, Zelda 2 is a side-scroller with an overworld that's not too dissimilar to that of a Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy game. Which is fitting because besides being a side-scroller, it is also an RPG with experience points, magic, and stat increases. This game is, rightfully so, considered the black sheep of the Zelda franchise. I actually, to an extent, respect such a bold departure on Nintendo's part for even allowing this game to be made, just from the concept alone. This is like if Super Mario Bros. 3 wasn't a side-scrolling platformer, but was instead turned into a top-down 2D shooter with gritty cutscenes in between levels. The bold nature of this game's brash departure from anything remotely Zelda would almost be respectable, if the game didn't suck complete ass. Okay, so to make sure we're on the same page here, yes, I have made it no secret in the past that I have a particular disdain for this game. Does this make my review of the game, then, biased and invalid? Well, considering that my hatred for this game stems only from having played it, no, not in the slightest. If hating a game because playing it gives you an ulcer makes your opinion biased, then I don't know what isn't a biased negative review. All of this being said, no game is all bad. If it runs properly, it has at least one good thing I can say about it, so I'm a pretty firm believer in being fair to even games I hate. So if you like this game and are a little turned off by what I've said so far, just wait and hear me out. I might actually say a thing or two that you'll agree with, and we can go at it from there in the comment section afterwards. So without further ado, let us start, as always, with the very beginning. The start of Zelda 2 is actually fairly well designed. The very first screen of the game shows Zelda in a weakless slumber, just as the manual story will tell you. But even if you didn't read the manual, like I didn't the first time I played this game, this opening scene is a powerful way to establish the player's goal, and the stakes at play in the game. Zelda is in trouble, we can see that, and the player must now save her. Now, it's a less powerful motivation if you read the manual, since it turns out that this is actually a 1,000-year-old Zelda the First, and not the one we saved at the end of the first game. But ignoring the manual, the actual game makes no mention of that, so as far as the player is concerned, this is a pretty good opening scene. The opening screen also manages to serve a more pragmatic function. The player is now introduced to this game being a side-scroller, a fact that many in 1987 likely didn't expect, and can get a better feel for the controls and the physics of the game. Okay, so for all the flack I'm about to throw at the game, I can be fair and say without shame that this opening screen is actually pretty good game design. It gives the player and Link some actual character motivation for their goal in saving Zelda. Seeing her in trouble from the get-go is actually a better way of integrating the game's plot than even in the original game. And having the game start in the side-scroller mode, even with no enemies to fight, prepares the player for what kind of game they should expect out of this title. Alright, so far so good. Now we just exit the castle and dear God, what the hell is this? Why does this game have such bad graphics? If you don't play a lot of NES games, you might think I'm exaggerating, but for reference, here is the overworld of that year's Final Fantasy. Look at the sprites on this overworld. The castle walls actually curve. The forests look dense and have shadows, and the colors just pop out so much better. And keep in mind, Squaresoft, the developer of Final Fantasy, was actually running a deficit and was close to going out of business while developing this game. So why the hell does Zelda 2 look like complete garbage in comparison? Nintendo was hitting the big time. Zelda 1 sold incredibly well. What did the dev team have to work with here? 2 quarters and a nickel? So the overworld looks like trash. Okay, but so long as it serves its intended gameplay purpose well, then I suppose there isn't too much cause for concern. Oh dear God, what the hell is this? Random encounters? Why? Who thought to put random encounters in a goddamn side-scroller? Okay, I think I have the answer to this. So Zelda 2 operates not only as a side-scroller, but also as an RPG, which apparently was Miyamoto's plan for the series from the get-go, but it just didn't pan out in time for Zelda 1. So this game has experience points, and level ups, and increasable stats, just like an RPG would. So then, what's wrong with this? Well, think back to other NES RPGs. What does 90% of the gameplay consist of? Yeah, so Zelda 2 requires grinding to beat, because the enemies in the game take way too many hits to kill from the get-go. So you need to buff Link's stats if you want to win eventually. But unlike in Dragon Quest I, where random encounters provide the player with experience points to gradually level them up as they traverse the overworld, Zelda 2's random encounters provide jack shit in terms of gaining experience points. Several scenarios only throw enemies or attacks at the player that provide no experience, and any that do include enemies that net XP usually only provide you with a paltry amount, so in the end, the random encounters only serve to break up overworld travel and constantly annoy the player when all he wants to do is go from one place to another. God damn it, why is this in the game? Alright, so the overworld sucks. Not a great start. But making our way to the first palace, things will start to get a little bit better. So when you first move Link over the overworld sprite of the palace, you'll enter side-scrolling mode and immediately be greeted by an elevator that descends into the first room of the palace. This is a pretty good start, actually. It immediately teaches the player that the goal in Zelda 2's dungeons isn't simply to head left or right, like in most 2D side-scrollers, but to descend to the very depths of the palace's layout. Making our way to the very first hallway, the player is greeted by 2 paths, one going left and one going right. This sadly is where the side-scroller genre of Zelda 2 begins to interfere with the exploration aspect of the game. In the original Zelda, the first room of level 1 showed the player 3 paths, one of which was clearly behind a locked door. This immediately let the player understand that he had to choose one of the other paths, acquire a key or 2, and then proceed. This worked because in Zelda 1, the top-down view of the game allowed the player to see the entire room. So a player would never have to experience heading towards one direction, only to be halted by a locked door that they couldn't see. In Zelda 2, however, Link can only see anywhere between 2 and 10% of any given hallway at a time. So the player has absolutely no idea what direction is a dead end and which one is correct. Metroidvanias solve this problem by making one continuous interconnected map. So players will have dozens of options of traversal all at once, some of which are dead ends, sure, but only until a certain point when the player unlocks an item that allows him to now go that way. This first hallway, however, only presents the player with 2 options, and if you chose to go right, then fuck you, I guess, cause that's the wrong way. Now you have to head all the way back to the start and go left to get the key, and then you can proceed. This happens in almost every dungeon in Zelda 2. You head one way, are greeted by a locked door, and then you have to make your way back to the start and go to the correct path. This is garbage game design. It serves only to artificially waste the player's time in lieu of creating actual maze-like dungeons for the player to map out. Granted, of course, the act of exploring paths and running into dead ends is a staple of video game dungeon design, especially within the Zelda series. But what makes it forgivable in other games compared to Zelda 2 is, once again, the camera. Top-down 2D Zelda shows the player most or even all of any given room, meaning you won't head into dead ends every 10 seconds from which you'd now have to backtrack from. And in 3D Zelda, even though you don't have a top-down view, you can at least see to the very end of a room, so again, you have the necessary information to know which direction you want to head in any given dungeon. A side-scroller, on the other hand, is not conducive to this kind of dungeon design. That's why Metroidvanias won't force the player to search for a bunch of keys to open specific doors, but will instead have 5 or 6 key items that serve as master keys of a sort, and permanently open up paths in the game world. If you ran into locked doors every 15 seconds in Metroid and were forced to search for keys for every single one of them, that game would suck complete ass. In other words, Zelda 2 isn't a bad game because it's a side-scroller, it's a bad game because its new side-scrolling gameplay was not given a proper level design to complement it. And speaking of poor design, the other major problem with this game is the enemies. Not only do they take a million hits to kill, but plenty of them spawn out of left field and just cheap shot you without any warning. Then, near the end of the dungeon, we're greeted by the Dark Nut. Oh god. Zelda 2 is not a fun side-scroller. This is fundamentally why the game is so bad. I don't think I could possibly come down harder on a game than to say its main mode of gameplay just isn't fun, but in Zelda 2's case, that's the unfortunate reality of the game. To describe why Zelda 2 is such a bad side-scroller, let's start instead with what a good side-scroller looks like. The NES in particular has such a classic lineup of great 2D side-scrollers. Just looking up at the shelf of NES games that I own, I see Metroid staring at me with all of its beautiful glory. Castlevania, Contra, Trojan, there is just a cavalcade of wonderful NES side-scrollers to choose from. But of all the wonderful NES-era side-scrollers, none make me happier to play to this day than Ninja Gaiden. Now, that might sound odd, since if there's one thing this game is well known for, it's being one of the hardest NES games ever made, and the first time I popped this game in and gave it a go, that definitely held true. So why do I like playing it then? Because it's a masterpiece of game design, that's why. At first glance, to a new player, this game is complete horseshit. Enemies are placed in key spots that make it difficult for the player to avoid them, or they guard a ledge you need to jump to and can just knock you off and one-shot you. But as you begin to sink your teeth into this game, you come to understand a few fundamental aspects of it that actually make the game fair. One, there are checkpoints across level screens, meaning that if you mess up and die, you get another chance to play. 2, you have unlimited continues, meaning that you can die forever on one level and still keep trying without being booted back to the start of the game. 3, the ninja is quick, agile, and able to somersault and wall jump, making the game not simply about overcoming enemies through strength, but also about evading and blazing through enemy lines. 4, every single non-boss enemy, no matter how hard they might seem, only takes a single hit to kill, whereas the player has a very large health bar, so once you do manage to find a way to get the first strike on an enemy, you'll immediately overcome them, whereas they need to strike the player a bunch of times for him to lose. And finally, all enemy spawns are consistent and are exactly the same each time you play a level. These 5 tenets of Ninja Gaiden are why even a trash player like me can blaze through these levels after playing the game for long enough. Once you get a feel for the ninja's controls, memorize the level layout, and learn enemy attack patterns, you go from getting your ass whooped on level 1 over and over again to being able to blaze through it in 40 seconds flat. This is what a great side-scroller looks like. There are other examples too, which actually have entirely different reasons for their quality. If you want to know why Castlevania works so well, Egoraptor's Castlevania sequelitis does that in spades. What I mean to say is that to be a good side-scroller, you don't have to be like Ninja Gaiden, but you do have to have some easily discernible tenets behind your game's design that make it fun. And Zelda 2 doesn't have anything of the sort. Instead, the enemy encounters in Zelda 2 come off as clunky and unfair. It feels like no intelligent design went into their placement or in trying to create any smart difficulty spikes. In Ninja Gaiden or Metroid or Castlevania, every enemy has an attack pattern, so these games reward players who learn them, pay attention to their environments, and then act accordingly. I have a photographic memory of these 3 Darknut encounters at the end of level 1, and I still can't beat them without grinding for XP and getting lucky. Why? Because Darknuts, as well as Zelda 2's other common enemies, like Gorias and Stalfos, don't have set attack patterns, but instead block and attack at random intervals. What this ends up producing is an enemy encounter that looks like this. Now, I absolutely assure you, if that could have possibly looked any fun at all, which I entirely doubt is the case, I will tell you right now that it is not. This game's combat sucks. Nearly half the fights in this game are you jumping up and down looking for an opening as the enemy proceeds to kick your ass anyway. Gorias will throw boomerangs at multiple elevations at once, making avoiding or blocking their attacks impossible in some scenarios. And the sword beam literally does no damage to them, or half the other enemies in this game. It's absolutely worthless against anything that isn't a Keese or an Octorok. So how do you beat this game? By not having fun, that's how! The combat is so fundamentally flawed that even if this game's overworld or dungeons had good designs and were conducive to allowing for exploration in a side-scroller to work, it would still suck ass based on the shitty gameplay alone. But considering that this game didn't manage to achieve success in those departments either, Zelda 2 is instead a complete travesty of game design on nearly every front once you leave Hyrule Castle. But here comes the real knockout punch, alright? This next sin is what absolutely kills any potential fun you might possibly have with this game. There are no continues. That's right. Die 3 times and it's all the way back to the start of the game for you. Why is this in the game? In literally every other Zelda game, dying only sends you to the start of the dungeon, meaning that you can keep trying to beat whatever obstacle has got you stuck without any major interruption in time. But because God is dead, Zelda 2 will kick you all the way back to the start of the game when you die 3 times, only for you to waddle your ass back to the palace and do it all over again. Even Ninja Gaiden is more merciful than this. How the hell is that game considered harder than this one? Alright, so we finally get to the boss, who's this horse in armor. Again, who the fuck at Nintendo comes up with the enemies in Zelda? This is actually a good fight since he has a discernible attack pattern, and defeating him is more about finding out proper spacing to jump at him and strike his head. If all the enemies in this game were this well designed, Zelda 2 might have actually been good, but unfortunately the first 7 bosses of the game are the only enemies that feel like they had thought put into them. So that's the first palace of Zelda 2. You have to then use the candle to acquire an idol, bring it back to a village, then be taught the jump spell in order to get to the next dungeon. These in-between sections of the palaces feel just like that. In-between sections. Their only purpose is to extend the runtime of the game and sap lives away from the player before they reach the palace, in order to artificially pump up the difficulty of beating them. Are they bad? Not really, but they aren't fun either, so no points there. Palace 2 of Zelda 2 once again starts things off by telling players who chose to go right to go fuck themselves. Yes, you'll be greeted once again with locked doors that require keys, but even more frustrating are straight up dead ends. These aren't too awful in this dungeon due to them only wasting a couple of seconds compared to unknowingly heading down wrong hallways, which will waste actual minutes of the player's time. But don't worry, Nintendo will find ways to make these awful. Just you wait. Besides that, my biggest gripe with this dungeon's design is the multitude of branching paths with keys in them. Now hold on, you might say. Don't you love dungeons with branching maze-like paths? it's that I love dungeons like these. Any dungeon that forces me to remember branching paths and choose which direction I want to go through first is a huge treat to me. Yes, they are my favorites, no doubt, but what sucks about Palace 2's design is that it's actually extremely linear, and it only creates the illusion of being a maze-like dungeon. Looking at the map, this is the correct way forward. It follows a straight hallway down to the left, then you descend through an elevator, and then you head right to the boss room. The branching paths, then, that you see mostly at the beginning and halfway points, only exist to hold keys that open the doors that block your forward progress. What this means is that a lucky player who grabs up the 2 keys at the start without any prompt to do so, and also grabs the power glove further in before heading towards the boss room, will have a fairly simple experience, barring the multitude of times he dies, of course. But if any player only grabs 1 key at the start, which happened to me on one playthrough, then he won't know until he reaches the power glove itself that he missed a key. So now you have to waddle your ass all the way back to the very start of the dungeon, collect the other key, and then you get the glove. Oh, unless of course you die on the way back, then you just need to waddle your ass back to the dungeon for the start of the game, that's all. On top of that, you need the power glove to advance through these blocks that bar off entry to the boss room, which are, once again, at the end of a hallway. If we went here first, then again, you have to waddle your ass back to the power glove. Oh, and you also didn't pick up the key at the beginning? All the way back to the start now. This game was either made by people deliberately being assholes, or these names on the staff roll are a lie, and Nintendo just gave a couple chimps an NES dev kit. To illustrate the problem with this part, let's look at one of my favorite Zelda games, Twilight Princess. In the Forest Temple, when you step into the valley with all these bridges, you'll discover multiple paths forward, most of which can't be traversed due to the bridges not aligning with each other. What you'll see from the one path you can follow, however, is that these bridges are moved by the wind, and the non-moving ones simply don't have enough airflow to activate their propellers. So then, the player thinks, if I am to move these bridges, I'll have to use wind. Seeing as that's impossible at the moment, the player will just take another path and eventually fight the mini-boss and receive, surprise surprise, a boomerang that manipulates the wind. The player will then immediately deduce that this is how he can operate the bridge's propellers, and is actually greeted by one to activate for the moment he exits the mini-boss room. That is how you integrate a new key item into a Zelda game's dungeon design. You tease the player by showing him paths forward that he can't access yet, make the reasoning behind that clear, and then allow him to quickly find alternate routes that will lead him to where he needs to find that missing piece of the puzzle. In Zelda 2, your forward momentum is halted by some blocks you can't break, and now you have to backtrack to find the correct hallway. That's all the thought that's put into this dungeon. It would almost be hilarious just how low effort this dungeon's design is if it weren't for the fact that I had to play through it 3 times for the sake of this review. Anyway, the rest of the dungeon is pretty uneventful. There's another hallway with the mandatory key that you have to backtrack to if you miss it, and then you fight the boss, who has the same head weakness as the last one, but at least you gain some minions as the fight goes on, just like the Gleeok fight in Zelda 1. Then you kill him and get booted out once more. Oh, but if you thought the dungeons were the only asshole part of this game's design, well then oh boy do I have a surprise for you. Death Mountain. In this game is a literal maze that you have to find the right path through, and if you haven't grinded at all at this point of the game, well then here's your punishment. You need to grind to make it through this part. There just is no other way. Death Mountain is long, dangerous, and confusing. If you know the right way forward and already grinded beforehand, it isn't horrible, but any normal human being playing this game for the first time has likely done neither of those things. You have to go through here at some point, either before or after completing Palace 2, in order to get the hammer and Spectacle Rock and access the seaside town and Palace 3. Speaking of which, now's a good time to mention that the dungeons in this game, to my knowledge, need to be completed in order, so don't even think about doing Palace 3 before Palace 2, or you'll be unable to advance through without the Power Glove, which happened to me on my second playthrough of the game when I tried that. Once you get the hammer and gain access to the beach via breaking this boulder, you'll have to do some side quests, first by simply making your way into the bell tower via the jump spell. I don't know if that can even be considered a side quest, but whatever. And then by retrieving the Water of Life to cure some girl's illness. Of course, this begs the question of, why didn't Link use the Water of Life to just wake Zelda and be done with his quest? And while I could use this moment to begin a rant on Zelda 2's inconsistent story, I'm instead going to save my energy on that front for the Wind Waker review, because God knows I'm gonna need it. Completing this quest grants Link the Fairy spell, which, as the name most definitely does not imply, turns Link into a fairy that's a tenth of his normal size. I really wish I could unsee that. The player can use the spell to access the path to get to this remote island, and then enter the third dungeon. Alright, let's not stick on this one for too long. Palace 3 is literally just a straight shot down a hallway for half its run. That's it. All of the previous issues I've listed with the game still stand as well, like the bullshit enemies. They are, however, also exasperated by the introduction of the blue Darknuts, who get a sword beam like the one that Link has, except 1, he can always use it regardless of how much health he has, and 2, it actually does damage to the player, a luxury not afforded to Link's sword beam. That's another thing about the enemies in this game. Not only are their attack patterns not consistent, but for some fucked up reason, they also will always have gear or attacks that the player does not. Every enemy with the sword has a longer one than Link does, which, just how? How? Look at Link's promotional art. This is apparently the same awesome magical sword you got in Zelda 1, and look at how long it is. So why the hell does it have the reach of a butter knife in the actual game? On top of that, when playing as Link, you can only block an attack at the same elevation, meaning that attacking high leaves the player susceptible to attacks from below. But because Miyamoto's apes are assholes, the Darknuts get to attack at one elevation while blocking at another. So not only are the enemies stronger than Link without grinding, have unreadable attacks, and are numerous, but they also have a wider range of attacks than the player does. The Gorias have boomerangs, so why doesn't Link? He had one in the first game. Anyway, once you head down the elevator at the midway point, there are 2 upcoming branching paths to follow. One of which pulls the old get the key or fuck you trick, but the other one has the raft. Then there's another long ass hallway followed by the boss room. This fight is kinda dumb. You just jump and whack, kind of like the first 2 fights, except easier because of the downward thrust, which allows the player to get a shot on him without being hit themselves. Then he dismounts and you literally just fight a blue Darknut. Is this fight hard? Yes. Creative? No. With the raft, the player can now cross to the other continent on the overworld map and head immediately for the dungeon. However, any player who does that will instead be punished by the game for it. You actually have to complete a side quest for a villager first by saving her kidnapped child, in order to learn the reflect spell needed to kill the boss. If you didn't do that, the game doesn't make it known that you skipped a step until the very end of the dungeon, when you can't kill him. Again, this is garbage game design. If you want the player to acquire an item to make it through a dungeon, you either need to make that clear beforehand by gating off the dungeon one way or another, or you should have it be found within the dungeon itself. As it stands, an unknowing player can waste a whole hour or more of their time by going to the dungeon first. The dungeon itself makes a slight improvement in its design, at least, by gating off the left hallway immediately, and by splitting the dungeon in half at this point. This encourages the player to explore the eastern half of the dungeon first, grab its keys and item, and then make their way west. Unfortunately, that's where the smarter design aspect of the dungeon ends. From there, it's just a straight shot to the boss room with a couple of hallways with keys at the end of them. Standard stuff. All of these temples begin to feel the same by this point. They look the same, they act the same, and have no variety in how you traverse it or what kind of enemies you encounter. The developers instead opt to buff existing Darknuts and Stalfos with arbitrary stat increases, my least favorite way of increasing difficulty. Wizrobes make their appearance here at least, but unlike literally every other enemy in this game, they're pathetic. Just use the reflect spell you hopefully picked up, and they die the moment they attack you. This is also how the player has to kill the boss, as previously mentioned. He's basically just a more teleport-happy Wizrobe with a larger health bar. After killing him, Palace 4 ends, and unlike every other part of the game, you get to immediately go to the next dungeon. Wait, so you're telling me I get to play less of the game? Oh, thank God. Palace 5, unlike the previous dungeons, is actually designed a lot more like how I would expect to see a level in a 2D side-scroller. There are dead ends, sure, but that's better than there being hallways with required keys that you can't miss. Now, one big fuck up the dungeon has is the illusionary wall right here. For some reason, you have to walk through it to get to the part of the dungeon with the flute and the key. There is a villager who tells you about this, and the developers tried to tease you by showing you this key behind this solid wall. So it's made clear that you're missing something at this point, but it's still a pretty dick move. What would have been smarter is if the devs introduced some rule to this, like the bombs in Zelda 1. But besides that one hiccup, this dungeon is definitely the least frustrating one in the game up until this point. The dungeon boss kinda sucks though. Unlike the first three, his head is invulnerable, making his weakness... Come on, do I really even need to say it? Yeah, just whack him in the belly 7 or 8 times. Then, bam, dead. Probably the weakest boss so far. Palace 6 is definitely the best one amongst these 6 main dungeons, mostly because it's the least frustrating design-wise. The path to it? Not so much. You can't actually enter the dungeon without getting the magic key from the hidden village. Where is the hidden village, you might ask? Well, within a forest that you have to cut down, of course. Fuck this part of the game, seriously. No normal human being can find this out on their own. I guarantee you that the only way kids in the 80s figured this out was with their subscription to Nintendo Power. Because not only does nothing in the game indicate that this village even exists, but the player is never taught that they have the capability to cut down forests. How the hell does Link do this anyway? With the hammer? Besides that, this is literally the only part of the game where that action has a utility. If you had to use a guide to get past this part, then don't feel ashamed. It was clearly designed this way to make this 4-hour game take months to complete. Anyway, this town will grant the player the hint as to where the last dungeon is, as well as the master key you needed to open it. This makes the last palace way more bearable than all the other ones. And if you had this item from the start, or better yet, the devs just didn't do all this hallway bullshit to begin with, this game would be a fair bit less shitty. Arriving at Palace 6, the first level branches off into hallways that hold extra rewards in the form of experience points. This is how optional branching paths should be utilized. They should reward players who explore them, without punishing ones who don't. And this dungeon manages to achieve that balance perfectly. Players can choose to explore the dungeon for all it's got, or can head straight for the boss room. And better yet, the path to the boss room isn't too cut and dry either. The game actually creates some interesting situations utilizing platforming. The first pitfall, for example, requires quick reflexes on the player's part in order to make it through. Then the section with lava pits and floating heads is actually pretty challenging, but in a fair way, since there is some predictability to their spawns and their patterns. My favorite part though is the second pitfall, where a player who thinks ahead, casts jump, and then times their platforming well can actually acquire an extra life. That's a neat little touch that rewards players for their excessive platforming chops. To get to the boss room, the player will also be required to quickly cast a spell, this time the fairy spell, in order to get through the hallway and fight the Gleeok. This fight is arduous in concept, but actually pretty easy in practice, since the knockback and actual damage of his attacks are pretty weak. And then that's the dungeon. No bullshit tricks with this one, just a fun little romp at the end of this nightmare of a journey. The combination of interesting platforming, the lack of any bullshit dead ends, and the ease at which the player can avoid enemies in these taller, more open hallways makes for an actually rather fun level design. If all the dungeons were like this, then the game might have actually been halfway decent. It's too bad then that the rest of the game after this point makes me want to kill Miyamoto for ever having funded it. Whoever designed this part of the game deserves to be strapped to a chair and forced to play Zelda 2 until they realize their mistakes when designing this stupid game. Seriously, whatever sick human being thought it would be okay to design these scenarios ought to reevaluate what his priorities are when designing a video game. This valley is filled with lava pits and hordes of flying enemies that will one-shot you off the edge of the map and drain your 3 paltry lives. Just when I thought this game was starting to get a little fun with the decent design of Palace 6, the game smacked me upside my head and reminded me of all its many problems. Once again, the enemies here have no attack patterns. They just fly around at multiple elevations and try to knock you into the pits of lava. This is another artificial game lengthener. The devs thought, why design another good dungeon or two to pump in another couple hours of content when we could just fuck the player with the biggest bullshit we can come up with. I feel like a broken record at this point with how often I say stuff like that, but that's because this game really just is that bad. It doesn't know when to stop with this kind of crap. The developers chose to make a bad game that takes you 12 hours to beat instead of a fun one that's only 4 hours. And it really shows in parts like Death Valley, which aren't in the game to provide any legitimate challenges, but instead to extend its runtime by draining the player's lives and sending him back to the start of the game, so he has to waddle his ass back so he can try it again. Once the player finally clears that death march, the last dungeon shall finally await. The Great Palace is actually quite different from the other dungeons in the game in terms of design philosophy. There are no keys, nor are there any locked doors even, and there isn't any gear to find either. Your goal is simple: straight shot it to the boss. That, unfortunately, while a simple goal in terms of its scope, is made difficult by the unfair enemy spawns, roided up versions of previous foes, and the asshole design of the dungeon itself. Remember how I said back in the analysis of Palace 2 how the dead ends would get worse? Well, here's the payoff. If the player goes left, the direction the entire game has encouraged you to go from the very start of each dungeon, then you will be given one last big fat middle finger by the devs, as you have anywhere between 10 to 30 minutes wasted by the fact that this is one giant dead end. That's right, half this goddamn dungeon is a dead end. If you went left, then too bad, because all the hard work you've done to get to that point has been for nothing. If you've somehow miraculously managed to not die a bunch of times by this point, you now have to drag yourself back to the start and go the other direction. One saving grace, though, is that if you die 3 times, you start back at the beginning of the dungeon, rather than the start of the game. If only they let me do that back in Palace 2. After you make it through that hell and beat the final boss, comes the greatest insult that the player can possibly suffer. Any feeling of accomplishment you might have had up until this point becomes negated by the easiest, most broken enemy encounter in this whole stupid game. Dark Link. Let's take a look at what the fight with Dark Link looks like. Yeah, that's a pretty pathetic way to end this nightmare of a game. After that embarrassment is over, Link uses the Triforce to wake up Zelda. She says he saved Hyrule, which I don't understand. This quest was about saving her, not Hyrule. Ganon's minions are still running amok as we speak. If she thinks that saving her life means Hyrule is suddenly saved, then that's one self-centered bitch. I don't get this line at all. It's so weird in the context of the game. Well, then the credits roll, a bunch of fake names are plastered on the screen to cover up the chimp conspiracy, and the game, thank God, is over. Okay, so I just spent the last half an hour talking shit on this game, but I hope at least that I made it clear why this game is bad, from a technical level, because this game is a real mess in that department. If anyone watching this thinks that I'm just being an asshole and that I like talking shit on games, then 2 things. 1, have you seen my Zelda 1 review? Because I love that game to death, and I think I really showed it in that video. And 2, I just spent the last week playing this game and writing this script, and unlike my last video, I didn't enjoy that process nearly as much. And I think that's largely due to how I feel about this game. I don't hate Zelda 2. Like, I don't hate it personally, on an emotional level. Don't get me wrong, this is an awful, terrible video game with some bad philosophy behind its design, and the director of the game himself even admitted in a 2016 interview to the fact that the game's hard difficulty was as such due to the fact that the game didn't have enough content without it. I don't know if there's possibly a more damning statement coming from a game's director than to say that the game was designed to be longer and not better. But despite that, and despite how much I don't like playing it, I don't have any passion towards this game. It doesn't keep me up at night like Skyward Sword does. It doesn't fill me with a deep sense of confusion and regret like Wind Waker. And it doesn't make me want to punt my DS to the moon like Phantom Hourglass. Those are the games that I'm passionate about negatively in one form or another. But Zelda 2 leaves me feeling empty. I play it, get mad, and beat it, and don't think about it ever again. In that way, believe it or not, that makes this the worst one, in my opinion. I have no memories associated with it. It doesn't make me think critically like the other games that I hate. That is, until I wrote this review and was forced to think critically about it. And it isn't anything I'd care to talk about with anyone else. So, should any living human soul play Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link? Absolutely not. I played this game 5 times to bring you that answer, okay? So do not knock the olive branch from my hand by doing it anyway. Got it? You better stay away from your NES for a while. You hear me? Don't play this game. Please. I give this shit show a 3 out of 10. 1 point for actually running. That's the bare minimum. 1 point for not being a broken, bug-filled mess, so again, it's playable at least. And then that 3rd point adds up from all the small good things. The music is good for an 8-bit soundtrack. The opening scene is good, and Palace 6 is kinda okay. There, that's every positive thing about the game. 3 out of 10. Hopefully I'll never have to touch this game again. Next up, Link to the Past. I'm actually excited for that one. If anyone wasn't as entertained seeing me talk about a bad game as when I talked about a good one, then just wait for that review, because I've got a whole lot of good things to say about it. Be sure to subscribe if you want to know when that one's out, but regardless, thank you very much for watching, and have yourself a very nice day.